So Hollow Knight Silksong has quite a few bosses. If you want to include all of the bosses from Act 1 to Act 3, there are 47 of them in total, and there are even more bosses if you want to play the game on Steel Soul mode, but I'm not going to include those bosses since those ones are going to be kind of like additional lock content. So however, in this list, I'm going to rank all the bosses from easiest to most difficult. Before I get into that, just keep in mind this is going to be a subjective list based on my experience. Obviously, some bosses you might have had different tools, or you might have gotten lucky or unlucky, and it might have been easy or harder for you, so take it with a grain of salt. However, without further ado, let's get into the bosses from easiest to hardest based on my personal experience. This is going to be all the bosses in the base game. At the time making this video, it is entirely possible that as time goes on, more bosses might be discovered, but these are the bosses that I have completed, which I believe is all the bosses that they currently are known. Starting with number 47, which is going to be, in my opinion, the easiest boss, and for good reason. It is also the introductory boss into the game, and that is going to be Mossmother. Now, Mossmother is going to be the first boss you're going to encounter, so you're still going to be familiarizing yourself with the controls. However, if you come from Hollow Knight especially, it shouldn't be too difficult since you already know what the controls are going to feel like, and this boss is going to be fairly easy. It's going to basically just be some swooping attacks followed by some kind of earthquakes where rocks are going to fall from the sky. However, very easy to predict and also very telegraphed, so you shouldn't have too difficult a time with that one. Then coming in number 46, we're going to have Classified Zango is going to be an optional hidden boss which you're going to do for one of the side quests in the game, where you're going to kind of assist this doctor's research. He does end up telling you about his missing assistant, and if you do end up finding him, he will be a boss. The only thing that makes this boss even remotely challenging, if you want to call it that, is the fact that he's got a lot of HP. The boss is very slow, very easy to hit. It's not going to be too difficult. However, it is going to be a fairly long boss fight because there's a lot of HP, so get ready for a very long and kind of tedious boss fight, but not too difficult. Then moving in to the next one on the list, we're going to be having Kragler. Now, Kragler is going to be another boss fight which you are going to be encountering during your adventures. It's going to be a fairly easy boss fight because you can pretty much just cheese this boss fight. There is going to be like this little platform where you can hide under it, and this boss is going to basically be spewing acid from above, and as long as you're standing underneath this platform, the boss can't really hurt you. It's very simple to do. You just have a little bit of patience because your attack windows are going to be fairly limited, but as long as you keep going back under this platform, you're pretty much never going to take damage, and it's a very easy boss fight because of that. Coming in next on our list, we're going to have Skull Tyrant. This is going to be the first encounter. Skull Tyrant is going to be kind of like this rhino spider thing. It's going to be doing mostly just charge attacks, a couple of lunging attacks, pretty easy to dodge. Just make sure you do end up utilizing the full jump because it is quite a big creature, so you're going to have to jump quite high over it. But if you do end up facing this boss early in the game, you don't have access to double jump. A single jump is still adequate. It is going to be a fairly predictable boss. The attack patterns aren't very complicated. As long as you are staying over the boss, it shouldn't be too difficult. Moving on next, we're going to be having Pale Stag. Now, Pale Stag is actually a very cool boss, one that is going to be an optional boss potentially. We have to find it very late in towards Act 3, and it's going to be a fairly simple boss. The boss is mostly going to be making use of these projectiles, which are going to be very easily telegraphed since the boss is going to, you're going to see like these spinning discs on either side of the screen, and it's going to indicate which direction they're going to be traveling in. So as long as you are aware of the sides of your screen and you're jumping in between these blades, it shouldn't be too difficult. The boss is fairly predictable in its moveset, and it's not going to be too complicated. Moving on to the next on the list is going to be Voltworm, and this one is actually a little bit of a disappointing boss because the boss actually looks really cool. It has its own like secret area on the map, and it's going to be a boss where you kind of think there's going to be like this epic boss battle, but unfortunately it's actually a little bit easy. It's a pretty cool fight. It's going to mostly make use of like these electrical currents and electrical attacks where you're going to see these kind of clouds of lightning that are going to start appearing, and as long as you avoid the clouds of lightning, it is going to be fairly easy to dodge its attacks. It's not going to be a very difficult boss fight. The attacks are fairly well telegraphed, and you are going to be able to avoid. It doesn't have a whole lot of health either. The boss does go down fairly quickly, so I don't think players are going to manage to have a difficult time with this boss, especially considering the boss you are going to encounter in the very later stage of the game, and by that time you're probably going to face much more difficult bosses which are going to prepare you quite well for this boss when you do end up finding it. Now, coming on number 14 on the list, we're going to be having Gur the Outcast. Gur the Outcast is going to be a fairly easy boss. You're going to be able to find him by doing a optional side quest which you can be able to find on the notice board, and this boss fight is going to require you to track them down, and when you do end up tracking them down, they're going to be this very big boss that's going to make use of a lot of like weird traps where they're going to throw these kind of traps all around the battlefield, and if you get close to them, they are going to spike outwards, which is going to somewhat limit your space to fight this boss, since if you're not careful, you might end up inadvertently jumping towards one of these traps while you're trying to dodge the boss itself, and that might make things a little bit tricky at times. However, for the most part, the boss is fairly slow. Their attacks are fairly well telegraphed, and so long as you're keeping an eye and tracking those traps, it shouldn't be all that difficult, but it can be a little bit tricky at times depending where the traps end up landing and how their attacks end up going. But overall, not a very difficult boss. Next up on the list is going to be Bulbeast. This is going to be one of the earlier bosses you're going to face in the game. It's a very important boss because it's going to basically be the way you're going to fast travel in the game once you end up beating this boss. It's basically going to make use of charging attacks. So as long as you're jumping over this creature and attacking it while it's on cooldown, you shouldn't have a too difficult time. It's a very early on boss, so it's not too difficult. It has a very big size, so you are going to have to jump quite high, but similar to the likes of Skull Tyrant, as long as you're jumping over the attacks and attacking it from behind, it shouldn't be too much of a hassle for you. The next up on the list is going to be Laced. Now, Laced is going to, spoiler alert, have quite a few encounters in the game, and they are going to get progressively more difficult. I think the game actually utilizes this as kind of like a tutorial for the final encounter of this boss, because each time you encounter it is going to be more and more challenging. However, the first time you encounter Lace, she is going to be fairly easy. She is going to be a fairly quick boss, so you are going to have to be quite nimble on your triggers. However, she is mostly going to make use of some aerial jumps, and she's going to be jumping and dashing across your screen, but it isn't too difficult in the first encounter, at least not compared to a later encounter. She still fought fairly early on when you first encounter her, so you shouldn't have a difficult time with this one. However, she can be a little bit tricky due to the fact that she is fairly small and she is fairly fast, so getting hits on her can be a bit tricky at times, but she isn't that bad. Next up on the list is going to be Chakra. Now, Chakra is going to be an optional boss encounter where you are going to be able to face her, and she is going to be the one that sells you all the maps as well as a bunch of pins. If you do end up fighting her, she is going to be, a somewhat of a challenging boss fight at first. She is going to be another small-ish boss that's going to be very quick. She's going to be throwing discs at you from all directions. She's going to be doing a lot of jumps and a lot of aerial attacks where she's going to throw these discs towards you. You have to dodge them and try to find windows to attack her. She isn't going to be that easy to attack since her attack windows are fairly limited, but she isn't that bad either. She doesn't have a whole lot of health. She does go down fairly quickly. So this one is going to be making its way on number 37 on our list. Coming at number 36, we're going to be having Watcher of the Edge. Now, Watcher of the Edge is going to be another very late game boss, which you're going to be able to find optionally. It is going to be a boss we're going to be able to find kind of in the middle of nowhere in the sand, and it is going to be a fairly easy boss. However, they are going to hit pretty hard. They have a very damaging sword attack where they're going to be able to do sword attacks are going to lunge themselves upwards and also dash downwards. If the sword attacks do hit you, they are going to do 2 damage each time, so it's a big damage dealing boss. However, the attacks are fairly well telegraphed, and as long as you keep your distance when they are going to end up doing those attacks, it shouldn't be too difficult. They don't have too much in terms of projectiles. They're not going to be able to be very quick, so as long as you are getting your attacks in and don't get too greedy and then move back and stay out of harm's way, it shouldn't be that challenging, especially considering the fact that you are going to face this boss in the very late stage of the game, and at this point you're going to have very advanced equipment, and you're also probably going to be very experienced, so it shouldn't be too difficult. Then coming in next on our list is going to be Fourth Chorus. This is going to be a very large boss you get to find fairly early on in the game as well. It is going to be a boss that's going to be very much on the slow side, which is typically the case with most of the large bosses in this game, now to think about it, with the exception of a couple of them. However, this boss is going to be a kind of giant mech-like robot, which is going to have 4 arms. The bottom arms are going to kind of do this horizontal sweeping attack, whereas the top arms are going to do this vertical ground slam attack. You have to be very careful though, because you are going to be fighting in a pool of lava, and you're going to be fighting on a kind of like rock where if the boss does end up slamming downwards, they are going to break parts of the rock, limiting the arena size. So as long as you are watching out for those groundward slams and avoiding the lava, it isn't too bad. You can only damage them by hitting them in the head, so it can be a little bit difficult to get hits on them, but this boss fight is mostly just going to be an endurance battle. Since the attacks are going to be fairly telegraphed and the boss isn't going to do anything too special, it's just a matter of being able to hit his weak spot. Since although his body is quite big, he only has one specific zone where you can end up hitting him, which is going to do damage, so you have to try and make sure you can reach that head, which at times can be a little bit difficult since it can be a little bit out of reach at times. However, this boss fight is not going to be too difficult. As long as you end up being careful about those arms, it shouldn't give you too much trouble. Coming at number 34 on the list, we're going to have Skull Tyrant Rematch. This one is going to be found, again, very late in the game, considering the first time you encounter it, they are going to be found earlier on in Act 1. However, the Rematch is going to be a lot more tough. They are going to be found at Bone Bottom, and they are going to be wreaking havoc on the little settlement down there. This time around, they are going to be a lot more difficult. They're going to have a little bit more health, and they're going to be having a lot more attack patterns to remember. However, this boss fight overall, again, especially considering the fact that you are going to have faced this boss once before, so you're going to have already familiarized yourself with their attack patterns, this one is going to be doing a lot of the same thing, however, with a bit more health, and it's also going to have a few more tricks up its sleeve, but otherwise it isn't too difficult. Once again, as long as you're jumping over the charge attacks and making sure you're getting your attacks in from behind while it's on cooldown, you shouldn't have a huge difficulty with this boss fight. However, it is starting to get a bit more difficult now, so you are going to need to make sure that your gear is starting to get up to scratch if you want to face off the rest of the bosses on this list. Speaking of the rest of the bosses on this list, we're going to be having Sister Splinter. Now, Sister Splinter is actually quite high on the list considering how early on you're going to face this boss. This is one of the earlier bosses you end up facing, and reason recently they did actually end up nerfing this boss. Otherwise, this probably would have ended up being high on the list. Very few bosses have been tweaked so far in the game. Sister Splinter is one of them. This boss is going to be kind of like a multi-phase boss where they are going to be utilizing a lot of vines, where these vines are going to kind of be limiting your arena space. You can break these vines by attacking them, but it can be a bit difficult to attack the vines whilst also trying to attack the boss and avoiding its attacks. It's also going to do a bunch of horizontal sweeping attacks, and the worst part is it's also going to be spawning minions, and in an arena that's already being limited by the vines that it's going to end up doing, and the minions can make it a lot more difficult considering your space is going to be constantly restricted by these vines that are going to be limiting your space. And if you combine with the fact the boss is going to often spawn 1 or 2 minions to a fight alongside of it, that can become very, very difficult, and a lot of players did end up struggling with this boss in the early stage of the game. So it did end up getting nerfed, so it should be a lot easier now. However, it is still going to be a formidable boss, and it can be a little bit on the challenging side, especially early on in the game. Next up on our list is going to be Second Sentinel. This is going to be another optional boss battle, which you can encounter by finding all the pieces of the Broken Heart, and then you are going to be able to construct this creature, which will then be able to be an optional boss battle. This boss fight is going to be a little bit on the challenging side, considering this boss is going to be moving quite quickly. It's also going to make use of a series of melee attacks as well as some ranged AoE attacks, so you're going to have to watch out for those. It is going to be a little bit difficult to dodge, especially considering the fact that it can kind of do both of them together at times, and that is going to make it a little bit difficult to dodge 2 different things at the same time. So it can be a little bit challenging. However, nothing too difficult, nothing that you can't handle most likely, so it shouldn't be something that is going to take a whole lot of time. However, this one is going to take at least a couple of tries in order to beat it. Now, coming in at number 31, this is one of my favorite bosses in the entirety of Silksong. It's not a very difficult boss, but it's just so thematic and so spectacular to fight. It is going to be the Cogwork Dancers. It's going to be a duo boss, and for the most part, I typically don't like duo bosses. However, this boss battle is actually so well done. It is a duo boss where both bosses are going to be kind of acting in harmony of one another. It's going to be essentially a dance that the bosses are doing, and you are going to have to dodge their attacks. Their attacks are very easily telegraphed. They're going to tell you exactly what direction they're going to be charging in. So as long as you are staying out of their attack paths, it shouldn't be that difficult. The boss battle is going to be 3 phases long, so again, it is going to require you to kind of make sure that you don't end up losing focus, because you can easily let this boss battle slip if you're not paying attention. Things get especially more challenging towards the last phase, start going out of sync of one another, and then it becomes a lot more difficult to track each boss individually. But a very cool boss battle, and also one that might actually surprise you in terms of its difficulty, considering how each phase evolves from one another. Now, coming at number 30 on the list, we're going to be having Lost Garment. This is going to be another optional boss battle where you are going to end up facing against Garment, who is going to have fallen to the corruption that has been seeping into the Citadel, and he is going to be a fairly quick boss. You're going to be seeing him doing a lot of corrupted attacks, where he's going to be spewing out these black balls that are going to then turn into kind of like these knives that are going to be spinning around. You have to avoid those ones. That's probably going to be his most deadly attack, since not only do you have to dodge the flying goop, but you're also going to have to deal with the aftermath that's going to be on the ground in the likes of those spinning daggers, which are going to be able to do quite a bit of damage if you're not careful. In addition, he's also going to be charging around the battlefield, so that you have to watch out for that as well. But overall, this boss battle probably looks more difficult than what it actually is. He doesn't have a whole lot of HP, so he does go down fairly quickly, so luckily you don't have to endure these attacks for super long, but he can be a little bit challenging considering how fast he moves, and the amount of range attacks which he does end up spamming out can be a little bit confusing at times. Now, coming in number 29 on our list, we're going to be having the Raging Conchflies. And this one's going to be very similar to the Cogwork Dancers. They're going to be mostly identical, with one attack that is going to be a lot more difficult, where they are going to end up joining in the middle and doing like this tornado attack, which you're going to have to kind of jump over and around, because this is going to be the biggest difference compared to the first encounter. This one is going to essentially, like I said, be very much the same as the Cogwork Dancers. If you already fought the Cogwork Dancers, this one should be very simple, but there is going to be one big difference where you're going to have one of their attacks, which is basically just an upgraded version of the first set of attacks, which you're going to see from the first encounter. But otherwise, this boss battle is going to be almost identical to Cogwork Dancers, so at this point, you're probably going to be a lot more equipped for it. Then coming at number 28 on the list, we're going to be having Raging Conchfly. Now, Raging Conchfly is going to be kind of like a larger version of these kind of like flying drill-like looking enemies you're going to be seeing throughout the map. It is going to be a fairly annoying boss battle because of the fact that this boss is going to be flying around a lot, and flying enemies, of course, can be quite annoying, considering it might be difficult times to actually land hits on them, since they are going to put distance between you and themselves. They're also going to be shooting around this drill throughout the arena, which can bounce off walls and potentially hit you from behind even after you have dodged it, so you're going to have to watch out for that. But overall, this boss battle is going to be mostly just a case of trying to actually land hits in, since it is going to be a flying boss battle. And that's probably the thing that makes it most difficult, is the fact that this boss is going to be putting so much distance between you and him. It can be difficult to land hits, and considering it's going to have a lot of range attacks, you're going to have to be doing a lot of dodging, and you're not going to be able to get as much hits in as you might expect, so that's what does make it somewhat challenging. Coming in at number 27, similar to Raging Conchfly, you're going to be getting the Great Conchflies, which is going to be essentially the same as the Raging Conchfly, but you're going to essentially be having 2 of them instead of just 1 of them. The Raging Conchflies are going to be a very annoying boss because every time you add a second boss to a boss encounter, it is going to obviously add a whole lot of unpredictability to it. And when you do have these bosses shooting these drills at you, they're going to be bouncing off walls. It can be quite difficult to track everything, and it can be very easy to take hits. So you're going to have to be very careful with how you do this boss battle. I would recommend trying to make sure you focus your attacks onto one of the bosses first and then try and deal with them before you try and move on to the other boss, because it's going to make it a whole lot easier if you can try isolate these bosses and try to do them one at a time rather than try and fight them both at the same time, which can be quite challenging. Overall, this boss battle is going to be a very annoying one though. Dual boss battles are for the most part very annoying in this game, and this one is no exception. A little bit challenging, but also a little bit unpredictable and not very consistent in my experience. And coming at number 26 is going to be the Disgraced Chef Lugi, and this one is going to be an optional boss battle, which you're going to need if you want to upgrade your needle, as this is going to be one of the ingredients that is going to be requested by the caretaker in the Citadel. And this one is going to be a somewhat challenging boss battle. You're going to have to find them in a hidden path on Sinner's Road, and they're going to make use of this kind of like range attack where they're going to be throwing, I don't know if it's soup or goop or whatever it is, but they're going to be throwing it towards you, and if it does end up hitting you, it is going to give you maggot poisoning, which is essentially going to mean that next time you heal, instead of actually healing your health, you're going to essentially waste it and only get rid of the maggots. So it's essentially going to take away one of your heals, which is very, very annoying. If you get hit by these attacks multiple times, you might have a difficult time in this boss battle. There are going to be some relics which can make it a little bit easier. One that's going to like not getting infected by the maggots, but if you don't have that one, this one might be a little bit challenging for you, since it is going to make use of a lot of range attacks, which if they hit you, you're going to get punished quite severely, making this fight a little bit challenging if you are coming unprepared. Now, next on the list is going to be coming in at number 25, the Unraveled. Now, the Unraveled is going to be a pretty cool boss battle. You're going to have to find them in the lower sections of the Citadel. They're going to require you to find a hidden key, and once you do end up finding the hidden key, you can gain access to the boss arena. This boss arena is going to require you to defeat a lot of little minions, and the boss itself is going to be able to spawn minions as well. Another element of boss battles which can be quite frustrating at times when bosses do end up spawning minions. However, I find for the most part the minions in this boss battle aren't too bad. They are fairly slow moving, they won't give you too much trouble. The boss itself is going to be making use of a lot of charging attacks. They're a very slow moving, they're a very big boss, so you have to jump over them quite frequently, and they're also going to end up, when you get to the second phase, making use of these spears that are going to fly throughout the map, and you're going to have to try avoid those spears. However, they are going to be fairly easy to predict where they're going to land, especially after you face the boss 1 or 2 times. Understanding how the spears end up moving is going to be fairly easy, and it shouldn't be that difficult. The boss doesn't have a crazy amount of HP or anything, but it's going to be a very cool boss battle. However, once you do end up facing it a couple of times, it shouldn't be that challenging. It can be a bit difficult at first, but after you give it a few attempts, it becomes a lot easier once you understand how those spears work. Then coming in number 24 on our list is going to be Savage Beastfly. Now, Savage Beastfly actually gave me quite a lot of difficulty when I first faced it. This boss is going to be fought once again in the lava section of the map. It is going to be requiring you to fight on an arena where you're going to have to face this boss on kind of like this rocky slab where the boss may end up doing downward attacks. And if it does do these attacks, it's going to break part of the arena, which means you're going to have less footing in order to fight the boss, since the arena is going to become more and more limited in size. However, luckily over time, the parts of the arena that are broken will grow back, so you won't have to deal with it forever. This boss is also going to be a multi-stage boss. When you do end up getting to the second stage of this boss encounter, it's going to summon minions, and the minions are also going to be quite difficult because they're going to be shooting ranged projectiles at you, and if these projectiles hit you, you're going to take 2 damage per hit. So it can be very difficult to deal, since the boss is going to do 2 damage, the minions are going to do 2 damage, and it's going to constantly spawn these minions, which is what's going to make this boss fight so challenging. Is mostly just the minions themselves, since those minions are going to be doing so much damage to you, and they'd be very difficult to track, since they are going to also be flying. You're going to have to deal with the flying boss and flying enemies, whilst the arena is getting smaller by the boss attacks as well. So not only do you have to worry about the minions, you have to worry about range attacks of the minions, you have to worry about 2 damage from everything, and you have to worry about the arena constantly getting smaller and bigger, which can be very difficult when you have 2 minions plus a boss flying around all over the screen. Trying to dodge everything can be quite challenging. Overall, this boss fight definitely is a challenging one. However, it is an optional boss fight, so you don't have to face it early on in the game. You can come back to it later on when you're more prepared, which could make it a little bit easier. Then moving on to number 23 on the list is going to be Murwing. Now, Murwing can be a bit of a difficult boss if you don't know exactly how to face it. When I first faced it, was challenging. However, once you understand the best tactics to deal with this boss battle, it does become a little bit easier. Murwing is going to essentially be this giant fly creature, which is going to be blocking your path towards Balhart. This boss is going to do a combination of charge attacks and as well as some range attacks. You're going to have to jump over this boss quite frequently, and you're also going to have to watch out for the range attacks. You will see these white spectral balls, which will be kind of charging towards you when it does his range attacks. However, I did find with this boss battle especially, it's actually much easier to beat if you do end up using your pogo ability. If you can get a nice angle, you can jump up above the boss and do downward attacks frequently, which can actually allow you to do multiple damage to the boss, and the boss doesn't really have any attacks that attack upwards. So for the most part, if you stay above this boss, the boss can't really reach you, making this boss fight a whole lot easier. It can be difficult to actually time that, however, because getting above this boss can be difficult since this is a flying enemy, of course. So getting above a flying enemy is always going to be a bit challenging. However, you might be able to initiate getting a chain of pogo attacks once it is stunned on the ground, and that can make the boss battle a much easier encounter. Now, coming in at 22 on the list, we're going to be having Trobio, and Trobio is actually a very funny and very cool boss. It's a very cool boss battle because of the fact that he's going to be very thematical. He's basically going to be the showman that's going to make use of a whole bunch of circus tricks, such as fireworks and other magical trickery. He is going to be a fairly challenging boss. He's going to be very quick. The attacks are going to be quite confusing since they are going to be happening all over the screen. It can be very disorienting when you have fireworks as well as a whole bunch of other things happening all over your screen. It can be a bit difficult towards the second stage, especially when it does end up becoming a lot faster and his attacks become a lot more frequent. This boss battle is also going to be a bit difficult to actually land hits on him since he is going to be a very agile boss. He's going to be jumping all over the screen, going up in the air, going all around, going underground even. So it's not going to be very quick. You are going to have to be able to survive quite a few attacks from him because trying to land hits on Trobio can be very difficult. However, when you do end up defeating him, he has a very, very dramatical exit and he is going to be quite a funny boss because of that. However, this will not be the last you're going to see of Trobio. We'll talk about him later on again, but this first encounter is going to be the first time you encounter him, and he can be a fairly challenging boss if you come unprepared. Definitely one that you will remember after you do end up facing, however. Then coming in number 21 on the list, we're going to be having Silksong Widow. Now, this one is going to be a main boss encounter, and it's going to be a very challenging boss encounter, especially how early on in the game you are going to face it. That is probably going to be one of the things that's going to make it so difficult, is typically people are quite unprepared at this stage of the game. It is going to be a very fast boss. It's going to make use of a lot of attacks where it's going to be kind of summoning balls, and it's going to be throwing these balls from above. It's also going to be a very quick boss where the boss is in addition going to be dashing across the screen whilst also making use of these balls that are going to be raining from the sky and being thrown out of the sides of your screen. So you're going to have to do a lot of dodging. You have to be very careful of your footing since there is a lot of things that are going to be happening, especially towards the second or third stage even on this boss battle. You heard that right. This boss battle actually has 3 stages, and in the third stage especially, there's going to be so much stuff happening on the screen. It can be a bit difficult to keep track of. This boss is definitely the one that I probably struggled with the most in the early game, and it is one that is going to possibly require players to come back to later and maybe get a bit better prepared before you end up facing it. Now, as we get into the top 20, we're going to be having a familiar return here with Tormented Trobio. Tormented Trobio is going to be very similar to the first encounter of Trobio. However, this time around, Trobio is going to be seeking revenge. He's going to be doing mostly the similar attacks to the first encounter. However, his attacks are going to be a little bit faster. He's going to be a little bit more aggressive. And he's going to be making use of a whole lot more theatrics, where he is going to make use of a lot of fireworks and a lot of flashy attacks. He's going to once again be a bit difficult to hit at times since he is going to be jumping and dashing and teleporting all over your screen. So it can be difficult to land hits on him. And he's not going to be one that's going to give you a lot of openings to do attack combos on, so you're going to have to pick your attacks carefully. If you get too greedy, you might get punished with tornado attacks, which are going to be fairly annoying to deal with. However, if you have fought him once before, this time around you should be more well equipped, and you're also probably going to be more familiar with his attacks, so it won't probably be as difficult as the first time you do end up encountering. However, since he is going to be obviously a harder version of his first self, I did end up putting him higher than this since he's obviously going to be just objectively harder, but at this point in the game, you're probably going to find him a little bit easier in the first encounter. Then coming in at number 19 on the list, we're going to be having Mother Duo. And the reason why this is so high on the list is because once again, it's going to be another duo boss. And duo bosses can be very difficult, especially when this duo boss is going to be accompanied by some minions. And it's also going to be quite difficult to keep track of them, since the area that you are going to end up fighting them in is going to be fairly small, and there are going to be 2 of them. So it's going to be very similar to the first Mother with a few extra attacks, and it is also going to be 2 of them instead. So this time around, it's going to be something very familiar, but also quite potentially frustrating if you're someone that doesn't like dual bosses like me. This one definitely can end up being a bit of a nuisance if you do end up facing it in Act 3, but overall, it's not that difficult. It's just the fact there's 2 of them, so sometimes things play out very well for you, and you get lucky they are nicely in sync, whereas other times you can be quite unlucky where they do end up separating, and you are going to have to be attacked from the front and behind at the same time, which can make this boss battle a whole lot more difficult and a lot more inconsistent as well. Overall, this boss battle, not my favorite, but definitely one that can be challenging at times. Speaking of bosses that like to make use of minions, Broodmother is going to be probably one of the biggest minion spammers in the entire game. Coming at number 18, Broodmother is going to be one where you're going to be able to find in the slab. They are going to be kind of this very gross type of creature that's going to mostly do some very basic charge attacks where they're going to be dashing and charging across your screen. However, they're going to be spawning so many minions that they're going to be just spamming out towards you every few seconds, and that is what's going to make this boss battle so much more difficult, is dealing with all those minions while the big giant boss is going to be charging up and down your screen trying to knock you down. You're going to have to make sure you dodge those attacks whilst also keeping an eye on the minions, because if you're trying to avoid the boss, potentially you jump back into a minion, you could end up taking damage, and it can be very difficult to keep track of everything on this arena. So this one is going to be a fairly challenging boss battle. You're going to be able to find it somewhere in Act 2, and it is one that's going to require you to deal with the minions quite frequently, because if you do end up leaving the minions, they are going to end up limiting your space that you can end up dodging the boss quite severely. So you have to make sure you fight those whilst also trying to do damage to the boss and not fall behind on your damage. It's very difficult to keep up with everything here, but after a while you do start getting the hang of things, and it does end up becoming a little bit easier once you understand exactly how best to deal with these minions that are being spammed constantly. Then coming in number 17 is going to be one of my more favorite bosses in the game. It's going to be Phantom. Phantom is going to be an optional boss, which you can utilize as a way to bypass facing the judge, which is going to be a slightly more challenging boss, which we'll talk about later on in this list. But Phantom is going to be a boss where you are going to be able to encounter towards the underside of the Citadel. It's going to be an alternative route, which is going to require you to do a whole lot of steps in order to get here. But once you do end up getting here, it's very, very cool. When you first end up hearing this boss, you can hear it from the distance playing on these organs. And when you do end up getting to the boss itself, you're going to see the organ music is going to stop, and it is going to end up being accompanied by a pretty cool soundtrack after that. Where the boss itself is going to be a very quick boss, you're going to see that she's going to be making use of kind of like this throwable needle, where she's going to throw it towards you and then dash towards the needle. So you have to kind of dodge two separate attacks, one the needle and then also her body itself when she does end up dashing towards it to retrieve the needle. She's going to make use of a bunch of aerial attacks, which is going to throw this needle downwards, horizontally, vertically. And also she is going to be quite aggressive in the later stages as well of the boss battle, where she does end up getting to her second phase. She's going to make use of these big AoE attacks, where you're going to see these big streaks of light, which are going to be able to cover a massive amount of area, and you're going to have to make sure you dodge that. In addition, she's going to continue and also get faster throwing her little needle around, and you're going to have to make sure you keep track of all the attacks that are going to be happening. It's a very cool boss battle. It's one that you are possibly going to miss if you don't end up doing a very annoying set of tasks in order to get to this place. But if you do end up facing this boss battle, it is a very cool, and it's also going to give you a very cool ability where if you do end up defeating this boss, you will be able to do the parry attack, which is going to be an ability that you might end up missing if you don't end up fighting this boss. Coming back to the judge that we mentioned before, number 6 on the list is going to be the judge. This is going to be the main path that you can get access to the Citadel. The judge is going to be a fairly challenging boss. This one is going to be one that a lot of players struggled with due to the fact this boss is going to have multiple phases, and each phase is going to get progressively more difficult than the last. This boss is mostly going to make use of this weird like ball chain, where they are going to end up throwing this ball towards you. There's also going to be a bunch of fire attacks that are going to be accompanying this ball, especially when we get to the second phase. A lot of their attacks is going to have like multi-stages where they do end up potentially throwing the ball towards you, and then you're going to see like a streak of fire behind it, or they are going to end up doing these big waves of fire that are going to slowly move outwards, and you're going to have to kind of stay in between the waves of fire, otherwise you're going to take big amounts of damage. Most of their attacks are going to do 2 damage to, which means you're going to have to be on your toes, since at this stage of the game, especially early on, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of HP when you do end up facing this boss, which is going to make it a whole lot more challenging, since this boss can very easily take you out in 3 shots. So you're going to have to be very, very careful here. This boss is going to be also an endurance battle, since they have a decent amount of HP as well, so you might end up struggling with this boss. If you do want to have a slightly easier time, you can try go towards the Phantom, which we just mentioned. However, the problem is trying to face the Phantom is going to require you to do a bunch of tasks, which are going to be quite frustrating and tedious. So it comes down to what you prefer. However, the judge is definitely going to be one that is going to be challenging, especially considering you're going to face this one all the way in Act 1. And considering this is Act 1, this is definitely going to be one of the more difficult boss battles that you're going to be encountering. Coming at number 15 on our list, we're going to be having the 4 brothers, Cygnus and Gran. And the reason why this boss battle is so annoying for me and so high on the list is it's going to be having pretty much everything I dislike in boss battles. It's going to be a duo boss, it's going to be spawning minions, and it's going to be having so much stuff happening on your screen that it's going to be quite annoying. Not only is there going to be 2 bosses, there's also going to be bosses that are going to be spawning minions. There's going to be multiple entities on the screen at once, which you're going to have to deal with, making this boss battle very inconsistent and also very frustrating if you're someone like me that doesn't like to track multiple enemies on the screen at the same time when it comes to boss encounters, making this boss battle very annoying and also somewhat more challenging. It's not as bad as some of the other bosses on this list, but it definitely can be a little bit annoying at times. It depends on how RNG treats you, where the enemies end up moving, if they're going to be mostly in front of you, if they're going to be up, behind, forward, backwards, all directions, then it can be quite frustrating. But overall, this boss battle is definitely doable. Then coming in next on our list is going to be Pinstress. Pinstress is going to be an optional boss which you could be facing in Act 3. It's going to be a fairly challenging boss fight, considering this boss is one of the most difficult bosses to actually do damage towards, since they are going to be teleporting all over the screen. They're going to be doing mostly range attacks, and it's going to be fairly difficult in order to hit them, because every time you end up getting close to Pinstress, they're going to just teleport or charge away, and it's going to make getting actual damage in this boss quite challenging. They're going to be doing a lot of damage, 2 damage mostly per hit. They're also going to be doing attacks where they're going to be throwing some nails, and they're also going to be dashing towards you, which is going to be quite annoying, especially considering how difficult it actually is to do damage to them. It's going to make the boss battle take a lot longer to beat, since you aren't going to be getting a whole lot of windows in order to counterattack them. So you're going to be slowly chipping away at their HP, and you're going to have to survive quite a few of their attacks. This one is going to be found towards the upper section of the fray, right at the top, where you do end up getting the double jump ability, and it is going to be a very difficult battle, especially considering how long the battle does end up taking in order to beat it. But once you do end up beating it, you get a pretty cool reward for it, so it's definitely worth it. But it is one that is going to potentially be quite challenging to deal with, especially if you come here unprepared. Now, coming in at number 12 on the list is going to be the First Sinner. Now, First Sinner is actually a very cool boss battle. They're going to make use of silk attacks just like you. It's going to be a very fast boss where they're going to be spawning a bunch of needles that are going to be attacking you from all different angles. They're going to be also charging up and down the screen, so you're going to have to not only dodge the boss itself, but you're also going to have to dodge these kind of like spawn needles that are going to constantly come vertically and horizontally towards you. It is going to be a very cool boss fight. It's an optional boss fight where you're going to be able to unlock a new ability when you do end up defeating them. However, it is definitely worth encountering, not only because of the reward, but the boss itself is a very cool encounter. They're going to have a lot of silk abilities where they're going to be wrapping themselves in silk and then spawning a bunch of range attacks which you're going to have to dodge. They are fairly telegraphed, however, they are going to be very quick, so you're going to have to be equally quick on your feet in order to dodge them, since this boss is going to be so fast. Definitely one of the quicker bosses you're going to encounter in the game. It doesn't have a whole lot of HP. It does have 2 phases, however, but they do go by fairly quickly. I actually kind of wish this boss actually had a 3rd phase, because I just really wanted to face this boss for a little bit longer, since it was actually such a cool boss encounter. And coming in at number 11 on our list, we're going to be having Bull Eater, a boss that is going to be encountered as your first boss in Act 3, your introduction to Act 3, and this one is going to be fairly challenging, especially considering how much HP this boss has. It is going to be a giant centipede looking creature that is going to make use of 2 phases. In the first phase, you're going to have to deal with either the head or the back of the boss, and it's going to be making use of a lot of melee attacks and some range attacks coming out of the back, which are going to be quite annoying to dodge, especially when you do end up getting to the second phase, when they're going to combine these attacks together. You're going to have to deal with the head and the back simultaneously. That can be quite challenging. This boss also has a lot of HP, so it is going to take a while to get through. It's not going to be easy to attack it, because it's not going to be able to get it damaged at most times. You're going to have to wait for its head to expose or its back to expose before you can end up doing damage to it, so you're not going to be able to chip away at it in most cases. So it's going to be one that's going to take quite a long time in order to defeat this boss, making it another endurance battle boss encounter. But once you do end up getting into rhythm of things, especially if you have the right tools, this boss can be a lot easier. It's definitely one that can catch you off guard on its difficulty, especially considering it's going to be the first boss you encounter on Act 3. And now entering the top 10 bosses on our list. Number 10, we're going to be having Grandmother Silk, and this is also going to be the standard final boss towards Silksong, at least the final boss of Act 2, which if you don't do all the additional steps will actually be the final boss of the game, depending if you actually unlock Act 3 or not. Grandmother Silk is going to be a boss battle, which is going to be a very cool boss encounter. It is going to be one that is going to be very quick. Her attack patterns are going to be fairly challenging to learn. She's going to make use of a lot of needles that are going to be falling from the sky. She's also going to make use of a lot of horizontal needles, where you're going to have to find the gaps between each of the needles and jump through them, and also avoid all the other attacks that she's going to be doing. She is going to also end up, when you get to the second phase, doing a whole bunch of cave-ins where you're going to see rocks falling from the ceiling, and that's going to make the arena a lot more difficult to navigate, because sometimes she's going to seal herself off and make it difficult to attack her, since she'll be on the other side of the collapsed debris, which can make it difficult to do damage to her. She's going to have a lot of HP as well, so the boss battle does last for a fairly long time. And it's going to be one where you're going to have to start memorizing those attack patterns quite well, because any mistakes could end up costing you, especially considering she has one of these attacks which does end up spawning a whole bunch of little like plasma balls all over the screen. If you don't end up finding the gap to dodge them, you can actually take 3 damage per hit at times, which means that your health bar can decrease very, very quickly if you're not careful this boss battle. So you can be surprised how quickly you can actually end up dying if you're not dodging her attacks very, very well. You can't face tank this boss. You're going to have to learn her attack patterns quite well, making this boss quite challenging. And that's why it's coming at number 10 on our list of most challenging bosses of the game. Speaking of challenging bosses, coming at number 9, we're going to be having Father of the Flame. And the reason why this boss battle is so annoying is because this boss battle is going to have 2 phases. It is going to require you to perfect your pogo abilities because you're going to have to deal with these floating fireballs in the air, and you are going to have to get on top of them and damage them from above. And this is going to be how you're going to be getting through the first stage. While you are damaging these balls, you're going to have to stay airborne, so you have to time your pogo attacks quite well. And while you're doing this, it's also going to be firing a bunch of other fireballs at you that if they do end up hitting you, not only are they going to do big damage, but they might also throw you off and knock you back down the ground. And you're going to have to climb all the way back up in order to start doing damage to these floating fireballs as well. And only after you do end up beating this stage, the boss is going to open up and allow you to get some hits in it, and then it's going to close up again. You're going to have to go through this stage of attacking the floating fireballs again, making this boss fight quite challenging. And it's going to be one that's going to be very different, considering it's going to be a very vertical attack where you are going to have to make use of your jumping abilities as well as your pogo attacks in order to do damage to it. Now, coming in at number 8 on our list is going to be the Lace rematch. This is going to be where you end up facing Lace again, and she's going to be right before you end up facing off against Grandmother Silk. She's going to be a lot more challenging at this encounter. She's going to be a very quick boss. She's very small, very agile, and she's going to also come with multiple stages. Each phase is going to be more difficult than the last. The first stage is going to be fairly simple, which is going to make use of a lot of charges as well as lunges towards you. After you do end up beating that stage, she's going to start making use of some more AoE attacks, and she's going to also end up doing a lot faster attack combos, and this is going to ramp up each stage. When you do end up finally beating her, you are going to be able to face her again later on, but this one is going to be found towards the end of Act 2, and definitely one that is going to be, I think, even more difficult than the final boss of Act 2 in my opinion, due to the fact that how quick she is, how small her body is, and because her body is so small, to be fairly difficult to actually attack her. And not only that, but she's also going to be able to block and parry a lot of your incoming attacks, so it can be difficult to actually do a lot of damage to her, since she's going to be well guarded and well protected from her own ability to evade you, as well as ability to parry your attacks, and also potentially counter attack you as well. She's going to be doing a lot of counter attacks. If you do end up mistiming your attacks, you might take some big damage back, since she's going to have a lot of counter attack abilities. And coming in number 7 on this is going to be Nyla. This is going to be one of the memory bosses you're going to face in Act 3. Nyla is going to be a very interesting one because of how the boss fight plays out. Is going to be a lot of verticality to it, similar to Father of the Flame, due to the fact that she is going to kind of pull away the floor beneath you at times, where you're going to have to stay in the air since the ground is going to be completely spiked, and you're going to have to make use of your pogo abilities as well as your claw lines to stay vertical, since if you do end up falling down to the ground, you're going to take big damage since it's going to be completely spiked off during her second phase of the encounter. And this is what makes this boss battle so challenging. She's also going to be doing a lot of dashes across the screen, and in addition, she's going to be making use of a lot of range attacks as well, and you're going to have to make sure you can dodge all these attacks whilst also staying vertical in the air. And a lot of the time, staying vertical in the air is going to require you to do a lot of pogo attacks on her, so you're going to have to be comfortable with pogo attacking. You're also going to be comfortable by trying to stay vertical, since this boss battle is going to force you to stay up in the air instead of using the ground as your crutch. Now, coming in number 6 is going to be a very special boss. It's going to be Shrine Guardian Seth. It is a very unique boss in the fact that it has a lot of backstory behind it, backstory that extends to real life even. For those who don't know the story behind Shrine Guardian Seth, Seth is actually named after a boy who did end up wanting to desperately play Hollow Knight Silksong, but unfortunately sadly passed away before the game came out. But he did end up sending an application where he did end up designing his own character, and he actually hand drew a character. Team Trade did end up creating a boss encounter out of Seth. A very cool boss battle. It is one that is going to be very reminiscent of, I guess you could call it, Captain America. The way the boss battle does end up playing out, the boss makes use of a shield very often, and the boss is going to be doing a lot of dashes. It's going to be a very quick moving boss. It is going to be difficult to attack this boss due to the fact the boss is going to be having a shield that's constantly going to be protecting it, so it can be difficult to actually land hits on. The boss also has multiple phases. If you do end up getting to the second phase of this boss encounter, they're also going to have a whole lot of AoE attacks where they're going to have this giant bubble around them, which is going to explode if you get too close to them, so you're going to have to watch out for that. But this boss battle is very cool. It's also a very challenging boss battle, one of the more challenging boss battles in the game, and I think even more challenging the boss that comes directly off this boss, which is actually Nyla. But this boss is going to be a very sad boss, like I said, due to the backstory behind it, but a very cool boss battle, and one that is going to be quite challenging, deceptively so, considering how cute the boss does end up looking. It doesn't look that intimidating, but it is actually a very, very tough boss, and one that is definitely going to require you to learn its attacks quite well. Then coming in at number 5 is going to be Groal the Great, and probably one of the most frustrating bosses in this game. And the reason why it's so frustrating is not necessarily the boss battle itself, it is the massive run back time that you have to do in order to get back to this boss. Not only is it a massive run back, but it's also one of the most annoying areas in the game, Bile Water, and you are going to have to make use of a very long run back in order to get to this boss. Even if you do end up finding the secret bench, which is going to possibly cut the run back time in half, even half the run back time itself is incredibly long, and it's going to make this boss battle very, very tedious. Once you do end up getting to the boss arena itself, you're going to have to deal with waves of enemies before you even get a chance to fight the boss. And when you finally get a chance to actually fight the boss itself, the boss is going to be this giant toad-looking thing that is going to be flying over this pool of poisonous goop. And if you do end up falling into this water, you're going to get poisoned, which is going to mean that the next time you do end up healing, you are going to get rid of the poison rather than healing anything of your own. So you're going to end up basically wasting a heal every time you fall into this water. It can be very difficult to attack the boss, considering the boss is going to be constantly flying over this pool of poisonous water, so trying to land counterattacks in can very easily knock you into the water if you take damage. Not to mention the boss is also going to have a very annoying attack when it tries to inhale, and if you do end up being caught off guard, you might get inhaled by the boss, which will then take you down for 3 damage, which can be quite devastating, especially considering the fact that you might not be able to heal if you are poisoned from the water below. A very annoying boss battle, mostly because of the run back time and the arena challenge before it. The boss itself, not that bad, but just everything else around this boss fight makes it so much more annoying and so much more challenging. So that's why I decided to put it number 5 on this list. Now coming number 4 on this is going to be Crawfather. Now Crawfather is going to be a very tanky boss. It's going to be one that is going to be a very unique boss in the fact that it's kind of like a court case where you're going to be summoned towards. And if you do end up finding this boss, it's going to be the later stage of Act 3. Like I said, it is going to be kind of like this court summons. And this court summons is basically a trial by combat where you're going to have to face off against wave after wave of little minions. And then once you do end up defeating all the minions, you can fight the boss itself. The boss itself is going to be fairly slow. It's a very predictable boss. The attack patterns aren't that difficult. It's mostly on this list just because of how tanky it is, how many attacks you have to do to take this boss down, and the fact that it's also going to summon a bunch of minions, which is going to make the boss battle a bit more difficult because every time you introduce minions into the boss battle, of course, it is going to make things a whole lot more challenging. The boss is also going to make use of these chained attacks where it's going to kind of shoot chains all over the screen, which is going to limit your movement quite a bit and make you not able to move around the arena very easily and very safely. But the biggest issue is going to be the fact that it's going to have a whole lot of health and it's going to spawn a lot of minions in the middle of this battle as well. So it is going to be quite a time-consuming boss battle at that. Then coming in at number 3 on the list, now moving into top 3, is going to be Crust Khann. Now Crust Khann is a very interesting one. I wasn't actually sure where I wanted to put this one on the list because it's kind of a weird one. It basically has like arena stage before you get to this boss battle where you have to survive wave after wave of arena battles. That is probably the most challenging part of this boss fight itself. The actual boss you have to face is actually very, very easy now that I think about it, but the arena itself, getting to this boss battle, is very, very challenging. There's going to be multiple stages that you're going to have to face. So there's going to be basically 4 little like locked in doors where you have to survive wave after wave of enemies within each floor. And if you do end up dying between floor 1 and 3, you have to start all over again. Once you beat floor 3, you can actually get a checkpoint, but you still have to beat floor 4 and then have to fight the boss on floor 5 in order to defeat this boss, which can be very, very time consuming and a very frustrating boss fight. One of my least favorite boss fights in the game, but mostly because of the arena stage before it. The boss fight itself is very simple. The boss is very slow and its moveset is very easily telegraphed. Not a very challenging boss fight, but the arena stage before it, very, very difficult. Then coming number 2 on the list is going to be Scarrsinger Karmelita, and this one is going to be a very cool boss battle. You're going to find it again in Act 3. This one is going to be potentially missable or optional, so to speak, and this one is going to require you to kind of make your way into this memory sequence where you're going to be finding a younger version of Karmelita where she's a singer, and you're going to be facing off against her. She's going to have a bunch of attacks. She'll be very quick moving. She's going to dash across your screen. She's also going to sometimes jump horizontally back up into the air, which is going to do like a spinning ball attack that is going to do a lot of damage. Also going to take you by surprise quite frequently because this move is going to be very untelegraphed. It's going to come out of nowhere and it's going to be very easy to hit you for 2 damage if you're not careful. Not only that, but when you do end up getting to the second stages of the boss battle, she's going to make use of multiple projectiles she's going to throw towards you. In addition, she's also going to do that kind of like spinning attack where she jumps upwards again. And also when she does end up charging towards you, she's going to leave behind her a trail of spikes, which is going to make it more difficult to jump directly over and land on the ground, since the ground behind her is going to have spikes on it. So you're going to have to kind of make sure you stay up in the air and kind of dash further away from her, which is also going to make counterattacking her more difficult considering the fact that she's going to leave a trail of spikes behind her in the second phase. So it's not going to be as easy to run up behind her and get attacks in. A very challenging boss battle, very cool boss battle, but one that you are going to be potentially missing if you don't end up doing all the optional bosses in Act 3. Then coming in at number 1 on our list, the most difficult boss fight, at least in my opinion, in Silksong, that is going to be Lost Lace, which is going to be the final time you're going to face off against Lace. This is going to be like a corrupted version of Lace. You're going to be able to find this as the ending towards Silksong in Act 3. A very challenging boss battle, mostly because of the fact that she has a few moves that are going to be very, very difficult to dodge. Most of her moves aren't too bad. They are fairly telegraphed. You can kind of get into a very nice flow of trying to deal with the moves. However, there is one move that is going to be very difficult to dodge. Since there is pretty much no telegraph, you're going to have to just deal with it. She's going to dash upwards and horizontally, and she's going to do this spinning attack where it's going to very easily be able to hit you. You're not going to know it's coming, and when it does happen, it is going to do a lot of damage to you. That is probably the reason why this boss battle I put it number 1, because that single move makes this boss battle so much more difficult. This boss does also have multiple stages, and each stage becomes more and more difficult. Since in the first stage, all you have to really deal with is melee attack, she's not going to really do a whole lot of projectiles. But once you end up getting to the second and third phase, she's going to have a lot more projectiles. She's going to start throwing up in the air, which is going to end up raining these like little daggers on the ground, which are going to be able to damage you. She's also going to have a bunch of AoE attacks where you're going to see these kind of like light balls that are going to start appearing all around you. If you do end up getting hit by one of those, you're going to take 3 damage, so it's going to end up draining your health very, very quickly. It's an endurance battle for sure, since each phase is going to end up being fairly lengthy. And if you do end up defeating this boss, you are going to have finally completed Silksong. At least the true ending is going to be completed. However, you have to put a lot of work in order to get there, since this boss is going to be a lengthy encounter and one of the most difficult boss battles in the game. I don't think this boss battle is as difficult as the boss Radiant in the first Hollow Knight. However, it is definitely an annoying boss battle, and it is going to be one that is going to push you, since this is going to be the finale of Silksong, and it's going to have a lot of complicated attacks where you're going to have to memorize, especially considering that one of the attacks is almost undodgeable. You can parry it at times if you do end up attacking the horizontal jump spinning attack that she does, and you counter attack her at the exact right moment. You can potentially parry it. It is very difficult to pick up since she doesn't really telegraph that attack at all, and that's probably one of the things that makes this boss battle so hard. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed my list. That is my list of all the bosses in Hollow Knight Silksong, at least currently at the time making this video that we know of. And let me know in the comment section below if you agree with my list. What did you find easier or harder than what I mentioned? I'm kind of curious what your guys' experience was, and I'll see you guys again next time. Take care, everyone, and bye-bye.